Yeah, so hi, I'm Dustin.
I'm Florencia.
And we're T-Powered Games. We work on the connection between narrative and game design in the games that we make. We're here to talk to you about writing and designing NPCs. We'll be talking largely about our experience designing the game we're currently working on, which is Dialogue: A Writer's Story. So that's not finished yet, so this might all be bad advice, but hopefully it'll help. The general format is that we're going to talk more about the questions that we asked ourselves throughout the process, because we think that's probably the most useful bit. Then we'll give you the answers that we came up with for our game, just as an example, and then go through a couple other games and their sort of answers. Different games, different types of games will be able to take away different things from this, and we're going to kind of just treat you all like game developers. That's sort of how we're talking, so enjoy. Flo's first going to talk about the connection between the player and the player character, because if you don't quite understand that, then you're going to have trouble understanding how your player relates to your NPCs.
Thank you. Yes. So these were some of the more interesting questions we found that we asked ourselves and that you could ask yourselves if you're making a game with relation to the player character versus the player. So think about, as a player, what does the player get to control? Do they control one character, or do they control multiple characters? How do they do it? Do they do it by pressing a button? Do they control them with a joystick? Do the characters walk around? Do they choose options, etc.? If you do just control one character, what's the difference between the player character and the player who's playing the character? What kinds of choices does your player get to make? And is there a difference in knowledge between the player character and the player as they go throughout the game? So to quickly give you our answers, we have the player controlling one character, Lucille, and she's controlled by clicking on different options during dialogue. Our game is all based on dialogue, so that's most of what you do. Lucille is clearly not the player, but the player gets to control Lucille's actions. And they do this by choosing various options, but all of the options that the player gets to choose are a subset of things that Lucille would do in that situation, or that you might think of at the time. And Lucille, being rooted in the world as a character within the world, has knowledge of things that the player doesn't. And conversely, especially if you're playing the game multiple times, the player might have knowledge that the player character, Lucille, doesn't have. Now, we made all these decisions because we were focusing on making Lucille, the main character, a believable, consistent character, despite the fact that the player has to choose various options and might choose things that seem a bit weird, perhaps. But by making them all a subset of things Lucille would do, they hopefully make her seem more consistent. So let's look at how other games approach these questions and the kind of answers they come up with. So we'll start with Dragon Age 2. The main character was Hawk. You controlled him or her throughout all of the game. However, you do get to control the other party members through the action parts of the game. Now, as with Lucille, Hawk has certain things that he or she says that are chosen by the creators that the player can choose. However, in order to make the different answers that the player picks seem more consistent and in character for Hawk, Hawk gets assigned a personality type, depending on the answers you've picked. And sometimes when you're not directly picking options, Hawk acts as though he or she is a bit snarky or maybe just pleasant. And this helps the character feel more consistent. The Fire Emblem series has decided to make the player control a strategist character. So they've chosen this, probably in part, to mirror the player's role in controlling troops by letting them control a strategist who makes similar kinds of decisions about the other characters in the game. One thing they do is make you an amnesiac as a way to explain to the player what's going on, because they've been thrust into this random fantasy medieval world. But we don't necessarily recommend that you do the same with your game, because that's obviously been overused, misused, but in this case it sort of worked. Now this one probably doesn't need a raise of hands. Has anyone played Baten Kaitos for the GameCube? Yeah. Yes, awesome. So this is one of the games that I think has had some more interesting questions, answers to the questions. They've clearly thought about this. So the player is meant to be a spirit from another world who's connecting with the characters in the actual game through some kind of magical process. And the characters don't actually know anything about the player and the world they're from. So for all they know, the spirit from another world could be you on your sofa playing and interacting with them through the game, and they do, in fact, look at you through the screen to you on the sofa when they talk to you. So that's just a quick example to show that if you take the time to think about these questions and answer them in a way that makes sense for your game, you can come up with some interesting solutions and choices for your game. But I think I've talked long enough about player characters and the relation to the player, so now we can talk about the NPCs.
So I think a lot of what you can do about designing NPCs, I'm the designer of our pair and Flo's the writer, and I'm going to talk about designing them. A lot of what you can do boils down to one really important question, and that is, what are your NPCs? What function do they serve for your specific game? Why are they there at all? And just to give you a few examples of answers, if you're making an RPG, they might be there to make the world feel more lively. For many games, they might be there as signposts to just direct the player, or they might be there as kind of an adversary of some kind. Once you've answered that, you can start to think about how do your mechanics help to convey character? How do your mechanics help to develop your NPCs without just needing extra dialogue or extra explanation? And I'll come back to this a bit later, but one of the most important things is that characters need time to develop, and you can't take that time away from the player in order to develop them. So in our game Dialogue, conversations are the game. The entire game takes place through conversations. So the NPCs are simultaneously a vessel for the story, but also they're kind of the levels, if you were. So like the level design happens when we're designing the characters, because everything the player does is have these conversations. The best way I can describe how our mechanics can kind of start to convey personality is by giving you an example. So I don't know how many of you can see him, but this is Adrian. He's a biochemistry researcher in our game, and he's really into his subject matter. He gets super enthusiastic about it. So, like, once he goes on a bit of a tangent, he doesn't like being interrupted. He's quite difficult to interrupt. So he has this sort of unique mechanic that's unique to him compared to the other characters, where once he starts going on about his subject matter, the player can try to interrupt him, but he just, like, you have dialogue options, and he just goes, hang on, I'm not done yet. And that's quite different from what other characters do. It's quite different from what you might be used to, and it says something about him as a character. He's really into it. He's really enthusiastic. So different games will kind of use their mechanics in very different ways. This is Final Fantasy IV. Classes or jobs in RPGs are kind of a fairly typical mechanic to shortcut to describe to the player what a character's capabilities might be. But they're also a way to give the character a place in the world. And I'm kind of showing you Final Fantasy IV because it wasn't so much this kind of tool for the player so much as it was a way to characterize the characters, to give them personality by just showing you. So one character changes from a Dark Knight to a Paladin. He gains healing magic and the ability to protect others around the same time that he's having the character development of realizing that he really cares about other people around him. And other characters kind of similarly reflect their mechanics. It doesn't really have to be a narrative-heavy game to convey personality with mechanics. So Pac-Man, the AI of the ghosts, actually kind of conveys personality. You have one ghost that chases doggedly after Pac-Man. You have one ghost that tries to stay one step ahead of Pac-Man. You have one ghost that's specifically bashful. It goes after Pac-Man up to a point and then runs away. So again, it depends on the game and what mechanics you have available to you and how much you might even care about it. But this is just to show that even games that don't really have much of a narrative can convey character through their mechanics. But still, your best tool is writing and fleshing out the characters, and Flo's going to talk a bit more about that.
So if you're looking to write some NPCs, there's a lot of general advice for writing them for books, for movies, for everything. All of the general rule of thumb, how to write good character stuff, still applies. These are just some of the questions that we thought would be more interesting to ask with relation to NPCs and characters in games. So think about your character's agenda, their goals, and how do they revolve around the player character at all times? On a larger scale, what's their story, and does the story change and evolve through time and through the game? And do they have a place in the world? What is that? What does that say about them? How does that affect how they interact with people, with your player character, and with society at large? So in our game, we wanted the NPCs to have a reason to talk to Lucille. It's not just, oh, you're the main character, we're going to talk to you at all times. They have their own reason. Things have happened to them, they want to talk about it, for example. So while the main character can affect how the conversation goes, the NPC has their own thing they want to say, and they're going to keep talking until they say it. They're not just talking for the benefit of Lucille or for the benefit of the player even. Also, as the game continues, and it lasts approximately a year, the characters evolve and change, and Lucille can talk to them and find out how things have changed, but they've changed often without her input. It's just because she's the main character doesn't mean that she has to affect all of their lives meaningfully at all times. And our characters, we try to make it a varied cast, as one would. So for example, we have a scientist character, as we mentioned. We'll have a programmer, a teacher. All of them have a different place in the world. Their day-to-day lives are different. They're more of an authority on their subject than the other characters might be. And they bring a different perspective to the game than Lucille, who's the writer. And this doesn't just apply to jobs, but race, gender, sexuality, all of these things you can think about for your characters and NPCs, and just make sure that they come through and that they create meaningful interactions, and you'll end up with an interesting cast of characters. Now, we probably all know games that have schedules. We've talked about Animal Crossing and Skyrim. So even small things like NPCs having their own schedules, shops closing at certain times, people being in different places in different times, can give the characters a feeling of having their own lives and doing their own thing, not just because you're there and you want to sell your stuff. That doesn't mean they're going to be there to buy it. And also the things that they do, for example, if they go fishing for 5 hours, that tells you something about them, whether they go to bed early or late, even little things like that. Mostly examples, also pulled from Animal Crossing. Now, I think we have a talk later about antagonists, but antagonists are pretty interesting in this context. Antagonists often need to have their own goals within the game, and the goals often have to be opposing to those of the characters, otherwise, well, why aren't they in the party? Because they're cool. So they often have their own story running in parallel. This is often not affected, or maybe not directly affected, by the player character, and you get to see them grow and evolve throughout the game.
We also wanted an excuse to have these two characters on a slide, because they're two of our favorite characters in any game ever. So just some kind of final thoughts. I alluded to it before, but good characters take time. They take the developer's time, which is why many games don't have good characters, because that time has to come from somewhere else. So as a developer, you have to budget time appropriately for characters. But it also takes the player's time, and you, as a developer, you need to budget time for the characters to develop. You can have the most amazing, most nuanced characters, and your players are just going to stereotype them at first, because all they know is the kind of the initial snapshot. So it takes time for that character to develop, and you have to make sure that that happens without stopping the player from playing. So to summarize everything up, pay attention to the relationship between the player and the player character, because if you don't understand that, you're going to have trouble kind of understanding how the player is going to relate to the NPCs. Think about why your NPCs are there, what function do they serve in your game, and how you can develop their characters through the mechanics. What they do say about them. Give your NPCs an agenda of their own, a place in the world, and let it evolve over time. And use your time well, and use the player's time well. Thank you.